acoustics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University. With me today is my regular co-host, Cleveland area attorney and Republican factotum, Jay Carson. Morning, Jay. How are you doing?
I'm good.
You know, I'm doing pretty well too. A little overwhelmed with work and so forth, but I think that's kind of natural in this late capitalism sort of cog in the vast machine.
The economy's humming.
Yeah, exactly, and the workers are being ground underfoot. Sector. But hey, before we get started with this week, I had a couple of quick announcements for folks. We are getting ready to engage in a small advertising campaign, given our limited advertising budget. And we want to make sure that money goes to the right places. So it's not going to be like a full page spread in, I don't know, like Vogue or something like that. But we want to get your views on where you came from, how you heard about the show. So we put together a really quick, simple, I think it's a 2-question survey. It should take you about a minute. So if you could do that, that would be really helpful to us. And I will put the link to the survey in the show notes for today's episode. So
is it too late to do a Super Bowl ad?
That's
what we should have done.
Yeah. That's next year. Next year, I think we'll try that. But also, late last year, Jay and I did our first ever live show at the Cincinnati Podcast Festival. That was a really good time, Jay, I think.
It was a lot of fun.
And, I think we're ready to do more, do our Politics Guys World Tour. That would be great to do more live events. So if you're interested in maybe having us come to your school, your organization, your bar mitzvah, your whatever, really, and do our thing, let us know. We are ready to go on tour, and we are willing to entertain all reasonable offers. So if that sounds,
even unreasonable offers.
Even maybe some unreasonable offers, depending on how unreasonable. But yeah, and if you are interested in that, seriously, you can reach us at mail@politicsguys.com. All right, so now normally this is where I would start in with our first story, but today we're going to shake things up a little bit. And Jay, you're going to be grabbing the wheel here, ripping it out of my hands, and taking us on our tour of the week. So without any further ado, Jay, have at it.
Well, we should say this is sort of by popular demand, and because Mike's as he says has been very busy lately, but mostly by popular demand. Well, our first story is the state of negotiations between President Trump and House Democrats regarding funding for a wall or some other type of border security. In our last episode, if you're paying attention, Trump has acceded to the Democrats' demand to reopen the government while the sides negotiate border security, albeit only for 3 weeks. Now, there is a 17-member bipartisan bicameral group made up of members of the appropriations committees from each house. And as of this airing, 1 week into it has proven to be less than productive. Trump still wants the $5.7 billion for expansion of a physical barrier, although he's softening a little bit about whether it's called a wall. House Democrats are still at the $1.5 billion, with Nancy Pelosi indicating that there will be no support for a wall. What don't you understand about that? I think was something of her quote. Democrats preferring border security enhancements like electronic monitoring. That said, Pelosi did make some statements last week, sort of noting that she might support, fencing similar to what already exists, and saying she didn't care what Trump called it. Trump, for his part, has indicated that he doesn't see any solution in sight. He's not optimistic, but there are some good people on this 17-member body. If he does not get a compromise to his liking, he is prepared to declare a national emergency, which would allow him to take executive action to allocate defense funding for this wall, although that may be constitutionally dubious. So, Mike, where do you see this going next? And is that an accurate description of the state of play at this point?
Yeah, I think that was great. I guess I look at this in two ways. There's the sort of policy aspect, and then there's the symbolism aspect. And in terms of the policy aspect, it seems to me that even based on President Trump's own concerns, even if we say admit all those concerns as being entirely valid, the things that he cites again and again, well, building a wall would not be the best use of our funds, the best way to tackle those concerns, things like drugs and human trafficking and the sort of things that he talks about. But of course, this isn't about policy even a little bit. It's about the symbolism of a wall, which is why I don't think a fence, build the fence is not exactly a rousing sort of thing. And so it seems to me there's.
But I mean, we have had, fence, physical border, whether you want to call it, for years and years. And I'm trying to think how many hundreds of miles.
Like 670 something miles. Yeah. And that certainly makes sense in certain instances and can be effective. But in terms of dealing with what the most serious problems are, things like, really beefing up our ports of entry security there and looking into a lot more vehicles that cross over, that sort of thing. I mean, those are the things that it seems to me that the vast majority of the research suggests would be most effective in dealing with these problems. But again, I don't think it's about dealing with these problems. It's about the symbolism of a wall, essentially, and that's a whole different thing. But to me, it seems like there's only one way that I see this ending, or at least the strong likelihood that it's always a mistake. Probably at this point, I should realize to try to understand what's going on in Donald Trump's mind or what he's going to do next. But I don't see how this doesn't end without the president using his powers to declare a national emergency and then that being challenged in the courts and, it kind of playing out that way. Because it seems to me the Republicans are not going to sit still for another shutdown. And even the president realizes that that's a bad idea. He took most of the hit for that. So I think he's kind of prepping the way for that. And that's kind of where we're going to be on, February 15th, I believe it is.
Yeah.
So, would you agree with that?
Well, I think yes and no. There's a lot that I guess we don't know how these negotiations are going to play out. There may be, some room. My concern would be if you are Nancy Pelosi, there's simply no way that you can live with yourself. I guess if Donald Trump gets $1 more for than the 1.5 billion, or that he places one brick or piece of fencing and can call it a wall.
Yeah.
The Democrats, I think the Democrats need this issue more than the Republicans do at this point.
Right.
So I don't see a compromise there, but we'll see. Maybe there's something else we can do. From politically, I think this Trump. I think we weren't on last week. At least I wasn't. So we didn't really get to hit on this, but yeah, the popular, the conventional wisdom is that Trump lost on the shutdown, and I think that's probably right. But he also, I think, has set himself up better politically going into this, because I think a lot of people will look at this as the onus is on the Democrats, who said they're going to negotiate in good faith, to come up with some sort of other proposal. And if there isn't one, well, I don't. I think Trump will be able to say, "Look, I told you so. How you want me to negotiate with these people? What can I do?"
Well, I don't think either side said they would negotiate in good faith. Both sides. No, seriously, the president said they shouldn't even bother if there's not going to be money for a wall, and the Democrats said, "Well, we're not going to give any money for the wall," and that was kind of going into the negotiation. So, to me, this is essentially an exercise in futility, and it's given the incentives on both sides. So, to me, the question really becomes, can the president actually go ahead and declare a national emergency and build a wall? And on that, it seems like there are some reasonable questions to be raised. There was a great article this week in a blog called "Take Care," as in the president shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Basically, it's a bunch of legal scholars that look into Trump administration stuff. And it looked into, it looked into the textual analysis and the legislative history of the National Emergencies Act and suggested that, well, you can make a reasonable case that a national emergency isn't just whatever the president says it is. And it's certainly not a slam dunk sort of thing, but it's something that at least there's a reasonable legal grounds to challenge, even if the president can just make up a national emergency in the first place. And then part two of that is, even if the president can declare a national emergency when maybe no actual emergency exists or it's very disputable, can he then go ahead and use the military to construct a wall? And I was talking this week with Ken Katkin about this, who, of course, in addition to being a Politics Guys host, he's a law professor. And
where's Ken on this?
He came up with about 6 reasons why this was constitutionally dubious. And so, again, I think, but it's not really about whether or not the president can build a wall. It's whether or not he goes to the mat for a wall, I think, is the key thing, So I don't know how this is going to play out. Certainly there's a Supreme Court that has a slim majority that is very comfortable with a great deal of executive authority. I would think there might be 5 votes, but again, it would depend on the legal grounds and how the construction would be done and that sort of thing. But in any case, it's not about that. It's about the president saying, I will do everything within my power to build a wall.
Yeah. Now, again, this would be a weird set of circumstances, but I think Ken's right. I mean, just in its practical reality, I think whatever district court this goes through, first of all, it'll be sort of there is sort of what's called the Trump judicial resistance, that will issue a nationwide injunction against this, and it'll go forward and play out. There's really not much law out there on this sort of national emergency. I'm trying to think of FDR declared a national emergency to break a strike in U.S. sheet and tube, right?
Yeah, in fact, Ken and Trey talked about that last week. Ken did kind of a very extensive sort of analysis of that. I think it was for the bonus show. It was really pretty interesting, actually. So yeah, I mean, so there are some precedents, but it seems to me that certainly there's a difference between the Korean War and which is in the Youngstown case and what we have now.
So I'm sorry, it wouldn't have been FDR. I was thinking it was during World War II, but I didn't listen last week.
Not long after. But yeah. So I think that's how this plays out, and I think it puts some Republicans in an interesting position because, of course, Republicans throughout the Obama administration many of them had been very vociferous, very vocal in their objections to this kind of untrammeled executive power and the president just, declaring these things by executive fiat. And now they're in a position where their president is doing that. And to their credit, some are saying, hey, we have a big problem with the president doing this. I mean, Marco Rubio called the national emergency idea a terrible idea. Roy Blunt agreed. There are a number of Republicans who said, we don't want to see this happen. And while if there are enough Republicans who agree with that, even though the president can declare a national emergency, the Congress can't overturn that, though the president can veto that, and so it would require a 2/3.
Right. And there we are again. Yeah.
So is 2/3 of Congress willing to say that President Trump cannot make up essentially a national emergency because he's not getting his wall? I don't think so.
Well, I think it's no, but I do think congressional Republicans have something of a free pass here.
How so?
Right. Well, because look, they can say we have come to negotiate in good faith, whether Democrats are going to negotiate in good faith or not. Look, we're willing to take somewhere between 1.5 and 5.7 for some sort of border security that would include some sort of physical barrier and can also include electronic monitoring and cameras and all that, which we can talk about the efficacy of that sometime. To me, it seems sort of silly if we'll put a lot of cameras on the border and we can monitor them and so there they go. But there's room there where Republicans say, look, we're happy to make a deal, but we can't. Democrats won't make a deal, and now Trump's going to go do this. And once he does, I think then it plays out in the courts more than it does in the legislature, because you've already tried it in the legislature, and if there was room to change that it would have been changed. So,
but I would think that you would find that problematic and concerning in that, like in the Obama example.
Oh, I do.
Yeah,
no,
okay.
I do very much so. And I think, as you've said, there are a lot of Republican members of Congress, also a lot of Republican or conservative writers who have made the same point. That first, I mean, I think conservatism has sort of a innate distrust of a overly powerful executive. There were sort of exceptions made in like foreign policy, type situations, Cold War type situations that we, sort of evolved into that the founders wouldn't have predicted. But I think there would be some pushback there, saying we don't want this just because next time the president who wants to do this might not be your guy. So I think there would be some certainly some talking points on that. I don't see necessarily it coming to a vote on it, though.
So you don't think that that those Republicans who are at least rhetorically against it would have essentially the courage to actually cast a vote to
maybe even if they do, I mean, to me it still comes down to kind of a so what, right?
Well, I mean, if you get 2/3,
the president either has the power or he doesn't.
Well, no,
right?
but
if
no,
I
disagree.
Fiat,
no, the president has the power, but also in our system of checks and balances, Congress can overrule that. And so with the supermajority. So it's not a question of does the president have the power necessarily, but certainly Congress also has the power to overturn that presidential decree. And so that's, to me, is, how important is this principle of, limiting executive authority when people feel it's been abused? And is it only important if if the executive is of the other party, or is it just in general an important principle? And I would hope that it would be in general an important principle.
Okay. I disagree that I think there'd be a good question of if there is an executive power to declare an emergency, can Congress undeclare it? I don't know that there's ever been any history of something.
There's an answer to that, because it's actually in the National Emergencies Act. That is part of the
Congress,
legislation.
Okay. It's
so
statutory.
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Well, then I guess then the next question is, do procedurally, let's presume Pelosi puts that up for a vote, would have the votes in the House, regardless of whether Republicans joined or not. And then
McConnell would not let it come to a vote in the Senate.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's exactly what would happen. There just would not be a vote in the Senate. Because
Mitch McConnell is a man without principles.
Well,
no, I'm sorry. He has one principle: Republican power. That's the only thing that matters to Mitch McConnell. He's a despicable human being, I think, at least as a politician. He might be a very nice guy. I'm sure he's, a wonderful family man and all that. But I think he's a tragedy for our democratic system.
Okay. Well, we'll that story we'll continue to monitor. But moving on next in what's sort of a weekly, so you think your boss is a jerk category. President Trump publicly criticized his intelligence chiefs, including Director of National Intelligence Dan Coats and CIA Director Gina Haspel, after they apparently contradicted him on issues relating to Iran and to North Korea and during congressional testimony. Trump saying that they were naive and that the intelligence community essentially needs to go back to school. Now, the story is, of course, as always, a little more complicated because Trump has since sort of walked back this criticism, saying that the reports that he heard, the news reports of what these intelligence officials said before Congress, their statements were misrepresented, misquoted, fake news, and now that he's read the whole transcript, he's very much in agreement with them. So to me, this is just sort of a more sort of daily Trump running the shop kind of thing. But I imagine you have some thoughts, or at least want to.
Well, I think the way you put it is very well. You say he just sort of, I just kind of spouted off before I actually knew what was going on, and then once I knew what was going on, it's how typically Trump. I guess he heard something on Fox and Friends that he didn't like, and boom.
Well, I think it was quite the contrary. I think it was he heard stuff from it was New York Times or CNN.
Okay.
And the sort of the headline was, intelligence chiefs contradict Trump, and at which point. Rather than picking up the phone or and calling the people who made the statements or trying to get again this is what I find a little bit bizarre. Why wouldn't the administration have someone? I mean, maybe they do. Sitting in the committee, taking notes.
I'm sure they did.
That's what you do, right?
Of course they do.
And you call and say, find out whoever, some person who calls the other staffer to say, hey, what happened in committee today? What exactly did these, folks say? Before you take to Twitter. Because look, I mean, I think Trump's point can be well taken. The media will pounce on any sort of disagreement, perceived or otherwise, even if it's just sort of shaded one way or another, saying official intelligence community contradicts Trump, right? But
let me ask you this. So if Donald Trump consistently says that CNN and New York Times are ridiculous, failing, fake news, and he sees something from them and immediately responds to it as if it's true, wouldn't that make him a pretty big chump, a pretty big sucker?
And that was my thought. I mean, that was my thought of because look, quite honestly, often when I read those sort of headlines, particularly from CNN, even more so from the more left media, that's my first sense is kind of an eye roll. I'm like, okay, I wonder what they really said. And you would think that. And again, this is coming to harken back on sort of a week after we all sort of hopefully sort of learn the benefit about not making snap judgments about little snippets of things that we see in the media. No, it was sort of goofy and disappointing that Donald Trump did this. But he assures everybody's now very much in agreement. They're all pulling on the same oar, and we're moving forward. So,
well, it seems to me on a more substantive level that the issue was that, that in terms of the testimony before the Senate Intelligence Committee, that I think it's important that we are, it seems, shifting our focus from kind of, non-state terrorism to the threat posed by Russia and China. I think it's important, to point out that Dan Coates said they're more aligned at any point since the mid-1950s. I mean, Russia sells China advanced weapon systems. They share intelligence. They share threat assessments. They're working on like missile booster development. They vote together in Security Council something like 98% of the time. I mean, this is a pretty significant threat. And for I think reasons why we can understand maybe the president isn't really keen on focusing on Russia in particular as much as some of these other things.
Well, I would disagree, and I'll sort of make that point if we're moving on to our next story.
Sure.
I guess and that's in this week. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and others, foreign policy officials, have made it clear that the U.S. would trigger the withdrawal process from the 1987 INF Treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. This is part of the treaty. There is a provision to get out of it, and there's a 6-month sort of exit from the treaty. During that time, of course, there's always the opportunity to kind of kiss and make up and bring this back. But this comes back after some significant U.S. Well, it's not even findings. I don't think it's in dispute that the Russians have deployed their what's called 9M 728 cruise missiles, which we contend violate the treaty. The Russians have since deployed more, further battalion of cruise missiles that we discovered last week. To me, first, the INF treaty has a special place in my heart, Mike, and you probably know this well. I wrote the big paper, in college, was on the INF treaty. But I mean, that said, I mean, if we're not concerned about Russia, I mean, I think stepping out of this treaty is sort of a message that we won't take Russian cheating lying down.
Yeah. No,
and again, you and I, we'd also debate the wisdom of are we better stepping out of the treaty and saying this is it, or trying to cajole them back into compliance.
Well, this is a case where I actually agree with the administration. I think this hasn't just been a recent thing. I mean, for years, I think the last 5 or so years, we've repeatedly, and this is obviously dating into the Obama administration, has said that the Russians are violating this treaty with impunity. As you pointed out, everyone except for Russia basically agrees that they're violating this treaty. Mike Pompeo says that they've reached out more than 30 times to try to get Russia to step back from what they're doing. And so at a certain point,
and they've stepped up instead.
Yeah, exactly. So at a certain point, I think you have to say, well, why, and I think the president put it, why are we basically unilaterally shackling ourselves to this, especially when China has no part of this? And that's maybe our greater concern at this point. They're certainly trying to increase their influence in Asia, and we don't have the ability to counter them in certain ways that we might like to because of this treaty. And so I think there are a lot of good reasons to say, well, enough is enough at this point. So I think there's a case to be made that we need to step back from this treaty. And as you said, there's still that 6-month period, though the Russians, I think, recently just said that, well, we're gonna get out of this treaty anyway. It doesn't really matter.
I mean, if they haven't come around,
yeah,
they're not going to come around in the next 6 months.
Yeah. So I mean, I see this as the right move, because I think it's certainly important to talk and to use diplomatic means and pressure as much as possible. But at a certain point, you have to conclude, well, this hasn't worked. And, honestly, Russia's in no position to get into any sort of an arms race with the EU or the United States. I mean, they tried that once. Right. And it failed spectacularly, and they have a pretty crummy economy. And so if that's what they want to do, I think that's a real big mistake for them.
Yeah, no, agreed. I think you and I are both on the same page with this. Although I would say, to some extent, the arms race that we would be talking about would probably be less expensive than the arms race that we were talking about years ago. But that said, I mean, the whole idea of and this it also puts a new wrinkle into Trump's view of NATO and NATO's view of Trump, right? Because I think we may see more of European concern now. The idea behind the INF, because I have to say this, because I worked really hard on that paper, but I did. I interviewed all these people, arms control groups in the State Department, and I got an A. It was a big hit. But so much the strategic point of the INF was the Russians had significantly more ground force strength than NATO did. And the idea was that the Russians could come pouring through the Fulda Gap, which is the
Fulda Gap. I haven't heard that in a long time.
Chokehold, right? And the whole Cold War would all come down to the Fulda Gap. And NATO did not have necessarily the sufficient ground forces to mobilize or get people on the ground to fight a conventional ground war quickly to stop a fast-moving Russian attack. So you would have these intermediate ballistic range that could be fired from Europe into Russia, and that the idea then that so what essentially happened was we traded sort of some diplomatic goodwill by saying, okay, we'll back off these, because Russians' intermediate nuclear forces didn't make that big a difference in their strategic calculus because of the superiority of ground forces. Now, again, I don't know how that situation has changed. My sense is they have much less of a ground force army than they used to, and it would be expensive. But
not only that,
neither here nor there. But let's put it this way: I completely agree with you that no more talk. We should walk away from this treaty. and proudly so.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I think that's part of sort of recognizing that the world has changed. And even from, post 9/11, that, now Russia and China are sort of our key hostile nations, competitors, that sort of thing in a lot of ways. And we need to focus more on that and take that threat more seriously. And so I get what you were saying earlier. And so I think that narrative that Donald Trump is basically a puppet of Russia, there are a lot of things that push back against that. And so what I was saying earlier is that just in general, Donald Trump is understandably, maybe in his mind, reluctant to say things about Russia that he doesn't have to, just because it gets into the whole collusion sort of thing. And so,
you don't want to mention the word just because it brings up the whole thing.
Exactly. Yeah. So, hey, but Jay, before we get to our next story, I'd like to take a moment so we can thank our newest supporters, if that's okay.
Please, yes.
Oh, we have Aaron and Hillary, both new supporters on Patreon, sustaining monthly supporters. Also, we have Teresa and Todd, who they were supporters. They're currently supporters. They increased their amount of monthly support on Patreon, and we really do appreciate that. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's always nice. And also, I should mention
it's not that Hillary, is it? No, I'm assuming it's a different one. Yes, okay.
Entirely. Well, I don't know, because who knows from the email address, right? That was the whole problem. But I'm assuming it's not.
From a private server.
Yeah, exactly.
Could be anybody.
So anyway, also I should mention we've set a new goal on our Patreon page. Once we get to $750 a month in total support, we are going to launch a new feature to supporters where every week you'll get the vote on what we discuss in our midweek show, which should be interesting. I think a lot of fun, actually. And the reason we set this up as $1 rather than a number of supporters goal.
Scott, this is for you.
Well, yeah, and the reason why we did it this way is that way anyone who wants to help us reach this goal, whether you're currently a supporter or not a supporter, you can be part of this sort of thing. Everything counts. So we're looking forward to doing that. Like I said, it should be a lot of fun. And not only that, but of course, all of our Patreon supporters get access to our weekly bonus show, my ongoing Nuts and Bolts of American Politics series. And there are a bunch of other things we put together for supporters at various levels. So to check it out, patreon.com/politicsguys, or you can just go to politicsguys.com/support. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, our next story, and again, this is maybe a little bit harkening back to Cold War days and Russian intervention and so forth, and just the trouble with Afghanistan.
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
The U.S. Has recently concluded some negotiations with the Taliban. Now, this is sort of a you and I can have differences, or are we negotiating with terrorists or not? But Afghanistan had formed a new government, which the Taliban was not recognizing. In the interim, there have been talks between the U.S. on and off with the Taliban to try to get them to join into essentially or accept an Afghan government. And those talks have apparently borne some fruit over the last week or so. That has then sent some alarms to the government of Afghanistan, which is seeking that the U.S. not pull out precipitously. And I think that's sort of the concern is that there would be an Iraq type situation. The current elected president of Pakistan has sent a letter to Donald Trump, received I think 2 days ago, indicating that he did not want the quick pullout and welcomed U.S. forces staying. So what are your thoughts there, Mike? I mean, Afghanistan is this is one of those places in the world that goes back to, Alexander the Great had trouble with Afghanistan.
A lot of folks on the left are uncomfortable with U.S. military action abroad, and I get that, given especially our track record of propping up some pretty awful people, some pretty awful regimes for questionable reasons. But it seems to me that this case is different in that, to me, there's a pretty clear humanitarian human rights motive. The Taliban's pretty awful. ISIS is even worse. And I've changed
Well,
my.
the Taliban, I mean, to some extent, is claiming that they have changed their ways.
Yeah, sure they have.
And I am dubious about that too.
We know
but,
what's going to happen if we pull out entirely. It's going to be another Vietnam type of situation, basically, where the government is slowly going to crumble, and I mean, it's going to be bad, and everyone who knows the situation knows that's going to happen. And
the Taliban would simply wait out the current government. I think that's right. Part of these negotiations with the Taliban would have been one of the conditions, to sort of our pulling out and they're joining the government is, they promise that they're not going to use, territory to support terrorism. But that's kind of a big ask for the Taliban.
It's not going to happen. Yeah. But in terms of the liberal view, if you just take a look at the vote on that McConnell amendment in the Senate, it passed overwhelmingly. And that was an amendment basically that just urged the government, the administration to not pull out, given the importance of, strategic importance of having a presence and so forth. I mean, that was a 68-23 vote. Yeah. And if you take a look at the votes against, of the 23 votes against, 20 of them came from Democrats, and I'm counting Bernie Sanders, although he's an independent. And all of the 2020 potential Democratic presidential candidates, Booker, Gillibrand, Harris, Klobuchar, Sanders, Warren, that sort of thing. Sherrod Brown didn't vote on that, I should point out, though he might be getting in. And I think that, go ahead.
No, I said he was busy.
Yeah, there you go. But I get that. But to me, I've actually changed my tune on this a little bit myself, Jay, because I used to be kind of a go big or go home sort of person. Mm-hmm. We're going to be in here and engage in this and help to build a strong government that can stand on its own 2 feet, or we just get out. But I've changed my thinking on that. If we haven't been able to do anything to help build a strong central government in 17 years, it's not going to happen. And I think, though, it's important that we keep these threats in check. And if that means a small, permanent, or at least multi-decade presence, I think that's okay. I mean, we did it in Korea and Japan and Europe on a much bigger level, where we're still there. So if this means that maybe for 20, 30 years or more, we have 5,000 troops or 10,000 troops in Afghanistan, and that keeps things at a stalemate, that's maybe a trade-off worth making, I think. And this idea of, we're bringing all the troops home, I think that's maybe outdated thinking, given the nature of security threats that we face. And we need to just maybe face up to a new reality where this is just part of how we need to do business.
Wow, the neocon Mike here.
It's not the sort of conclusion I come at lightly, because these things obviously have costs. But given what seems to be the conclusion of people who really understand the terrorist threat and the potential damage that can be done, I think this is maybe this minor troop presence is a cost that we should be willing to bear, just like we have for generations in Korea on a much bigger level, and in Japan and Europe and a lot of other places around the globe.
Yeah, and throughout a lot of places in Southeast Asia, and I mean, I think you're exactly right. And again, I welcome you back to the fold. No, and there is the argument, and again, this is the division in sort of the Trump's populist vision of what are we doing there? Let's just get out. We don't need to be the world's policeman. And my response always to those arguments, the other response is, look, somebody's going to be the world's policeman. Either you're going to have no police, which is not a good situation, or you'll have the Russians being the world's policeman.
Yeah.
Or the Chinese, where you're regionally talking about. In this case, it would be more likely the Russians. They've expressed interest in the area before, but so I think that is the cost of leadership. And if you want American leadership, this is part of it. I agree. I mean, look, do we need to have a full on
Yeah.
occupation. I mean, and
Sure.
obviously no, and obviously that's not what we have now, nor have we had that since probably the early 2000s, right, when we had the significant troop presence in the war. But no, I think keeping troops there are good. And the other point that I always make is this is a signal to allies in the region that when the U.S. makes commitments to stability, regional stability, they don't abandon them quickly.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the lesson that we learned from Iraq, right? I mean, and the Middle East when we pulled out so precipitously, and we just left that power vacuum, and that was a great thing for Iran. It was a great thing for Russia, and the region is in many ways, some would argue, actually worse than before we got involved in the first place. So we do not want a repeat of that sort of thing. And God knows that region has enough problems already at Afghanistan, Pakistan, into their hotbed for terrorism,
Yeah. So our last story we're moving on to is, and again, this is more, this is a big like foreign policy week.
Yeah, no kidding.
And maybe that's just because there's been an absence of, there was the shutdown and now there's not the shutdown. There's less, domestic stuff. But this is another area where I think you and I might be in agreement, oddly, and that comes to Venezuela. As of 2 weeks ago, the Venezuelan General Assembly named Juan Guaido as the interim president, as replacing, can I say it, socialist strongman?
Sure, I would.
Nicolas,
Go ahead. Go
Nicolas
for it.
Maduro, who had presided over sort of the absolute collapse of the country economically. The U.S. was quick, one of the first to recognize Guaido as the legitimate president of Venezuela. And hearteningly, many others followed suit. Mr. Maduro has not conceded, and in fact still controls significant portions of the military security forces. And Venezuela is really sort of a tipping point of potential civil war. But I think we ought to talk about this as sort of a pivot, maybe unintended, maybe of necessity, to Latin America in our foreign policy, which is something we don't typically think about or talk about a lot. And I think this is the Trump administration is seeing this as an opening to lessen Cuban influence in Latin America and sort of reassert U.S. I don't know, should we say hegemony? That's a good political science word, but or maybe just U.S. influence in the region. So, what are your thoughts on Venezuela and where you go from here?
Well, I agree that this was the right move. And again, there are some on the left who have concerns about the U.S. intervening in Latin America. We have a particularly, I would argue, dishonorable history. But in this case, the Venezuelan legislature was following the rule of law. And what we did is backed by by many other countries in the hemisphere. So I see this as a different sort of situation. But to me, part of it is this goes back to the Russia situation. Russia has been one of Maduro's biggest backers because it's actually in Russia's strategic interest to have Venezuela be a total mess.
Yeah. It's in Russia's strategic interest to have most places be a total mess.
Well, no, Venezuela particularly, because this gets into the energy sector. Venezuela has by far the world's largest proven reserves of oil. And because they've been in such a mess for a number of years now, their oil production is way, way down. Now, Russia is also one of the biggest producers of oil in the world. They're in the top 10 there, number 8. Actually. And so what's bad for another producer is good for them. And so, I mean, that's definitely part of the calculus for Russia helping out so much, right? And it's also, interestingly to me, at least kind of pulling back, part of the reason why both Russia and Venezuela are kind of crummy economies. There's a thing in international politics called the resource curse. I don't know if you're familiar with that term, Jay.
I am.
Okay, yeah. So basically, for folks who don't know, it's kind of like the equivalent of somebody who decides, well, I'm a very talented, say, baseball player, and I'm just gonna just not worry about getting an education. I'm just gonna assume I'm gonna get into the majors, and then you I don't know, you dislocate something or you break your leg, and all of a sudden you've got no plan B, and that's what a lot of these countries are. Venezuela gets something between 70 and 80% of its GDP through the energy sector, which is just nuts. And Russia is also like somewhere around half, between 30 and 50% of its GDP is oil
Sure.
and gas. And so that really kind of boxes them in a lot of ways. And that doesn't have to be that way. I mean, Canada's has the number three amount of proven energy reserves, and they only get like a little over 10% of their GDP for the energy sector. So it's a matter of diversification. Russia hasn't done it. Venezuela hasn't done it. And that's a big part of the reason why they're in such a mess, as they are.
Well, I'll raise another reason.
Yeah.
I'll drop the S word on you, and that is socialism. Sort of the idea that as part of this, I mean, Hugo Chavez, the plan was, I mean, he essentially, nationalized, ran this the oil and gas industry as sort of a part and parcel of his country, and this was a problem. I mean, when you have a country that does not allow businesses to grow organically and spread and have other sectors emerge, you get this sort of government monopoly on energy. And again, when oil prices were high, Venezuela was riding high. When that crash came, there was no diversification, and also there was, again, just this complete dependence on the government, because there had been little or no private industry, because
Right.
Chavez and Maduro, who followed him, did not believe in that model. So I think, so many of the economic problems, it's not simply because, they have a lot of oil, that's their problem. It's because of the way they ran their economy as a command economy for years and years.
I'll push back a little bit on that. I mean, I think you're right in part. Certainly, rule of law and property rights are hugely, and you've made this point a bunch of times, that businesses need that stability, and if they think that their investments might be nationalized, well, then that's
why would I invest in Venezuela? Why would I build a computer place, chip making place in Venezuela? Yeah,
exactly. But I mean, if you look at Venezuela back in the early '80s, things looked really good there. They were one of the up and coming countries, one of maybe the top up and coming country in Latin America. And then they had the currency and debt crisis in the middle of the decade, and things really started to fall apart. And Chavez really was, I think, more of a populist kind of reaction to. And so I would say that's more of a populist movement than a socialist movement. But the point being, no matter how you characterize it,
he identifies as socialist.
Sure, he would have identified as anything to gain power. I mean, I don't think it was about socialism. It was about Hugo Chavez, basically. Sure. But yeah, I mean, you can't just.
I would posit that it's that way with a lot of socialists.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And you can't just start nationalizing businesses and then expect things to go okay, essentially. So yeah. I think you're. But I back to American foreign policy, I absolutely agree with what we're doing. And I don't know if there's going to be enough pressure that will be brought to bear to get him out of office. But certainly it's hard to imagine things getting worse than they are in Venezuela now. And at some point you would think something has to give. But I hope that they actually do bottom out, so maybe they can bounce back from this just horrific situation they're in right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think the concern comes of listen, if there is an armed conflict, because Maduro plainly holds the upper hand at this point, at least, with control of the, you don't even call them military there, it's security forces, right? It's, sort of state police. And to the extent that would be aided by Cuba, perhaps by Russia, would there be a call for U.S. intervention to do that? And this is going back to sort of the 1830s, Monroe Doctrine, sort of 1820s, Monroe Doctrine sort of idea that the U.S. will step up to keep European or other non-Western continental powers out of South America.
Yeah.
And we'll see. I mean, I don't know that Trump would be willing to do that, but this is something different. I will note again with some concern, the folks who have not greeted this the recognition of the Guaido presidency with enthusiasm were Bernie Sanders and Alexandria
Ocasio-Cortez. Yeah.
Yes. So, and sort of and again, not necessarily issuing statements of support for Maduro, but this very well, we shouldn't be involved. We shouldn't get involved in this kind of thing. And there was the implication in their statements that Maduro was the legitimate president, and I think a lot of people on the right find that troubling.
So. Yeah, no, and I think part of that is that kind of reflexive. If Donald Trump's administration does anything, we'll just assume it's bad and kind of proceed from that sort of thing, because that's our primary orientation. And I think there's.
Well, I think it's less Trump. I think it goes deeper than that, though. I think if it was any other Republican president, you would have had the same thing. It's sort of the. I don't know. There's the tendency on the left to romanticize Latin American socialist dictators, right? I mean, it just I don't know where it comes from. It's Che Guevara and the cute cap.
I think that's a thing of the past largely. I mean, I think again, I understand there being a little bit of hesitancy, because I believe if you look back at our involvement in Latin America in general, we've done some incredibly shady things.
Right.
And so I think it's good.
I think that's all part of the same thing, that they see that as any U.S. involvement must be propping up some crony capitalist dictator, as opposed to the dashing romantic heroes of the people. That's sort of the view.
And this is a different situation in that, I mean, if you take a look at, kind of the rule of law and what the Constitution in Venezuela says, if clearly the side of right here is with the legislature, it seems to me. And so that's different than propping up Batista in Cuba or something like that. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, on that point of agreement,
we've agreed a lot.
We did.
Well, what the politics used to stop at the water's edge. I guess Jay, you and I still believe in that, huh?
Absolutely.
So yeah. But as soon as we're done with this, Jay, we'll talk a little bit in the bonus show about I think the Cory Booker entering into the 2020 presidential race, and Howard Schultz maybe not entering, and everyone just losing their minds about that, at least on the Democratic side, and maybe some other stuff as well, time permitting. And of course, if you're a supporter, that should be in your podcast app by the time you hear this, at least if I'm doing my job right. And if you're not yet a supporter, you can become one by going to our Patreon page. That's patreon.com/Politics Guys. Also, please, if you haven't taken our listener survey, short, quick, we'd really appreciate it. The link is there in the show notes. And if you're not already a subscriber to the show, that would be great. And if you could share episodes, leave comments on iTunes, all that sort of thing, we would appreciate it. If you want to get in touch with us, it's mail@politicsguys.com. There's also our Facebook page, facebook.com/politicsguys. And we are on Twitter @politicsguys. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Michael Baranowski, Jay Carson, Trey Orndorff, Will Miller, Bruce Johnson, and Wilmer Moreno. Today's show is produced by Jay Carson and Michael Baranowski. We'll be back with a new show on Wednesday. We hope you'll join us.